Welcome back. That was interesting. Sophie is just pulling rabbits out of hats here. There's a problem with connections of various kinds. So apologies to those who dropped out and thanks for those who have come back in. Well done. If you could type into the chat box if you can hear this and see it, that would be fantastic. And just checking, Sophie, that we're recording again. Great. Okay, so here we go. Back to looking at this, working on PD for non-EL teachers at great length. Okay, so we were talking about using those questions and what would be appropriate. I think we might move on now. Yeah, one thing to point out here is the difference between questions for vocabulary. You can use the item in those questions, you know, as we did, is the coast, the land, or the sea. But in questions, when you're unpacking structures with students, you can't ask questions based on the structure. So I'm working on PD for non-ELT teachers. Am I working on PD for non-ELT teachers? It's very easy for students to answer because they haven't heard the negative. They don't understand fully. There's no point asking those questions. So we're going to have a look at some slightly more complex timelines. You can see there, if you recall the figure looking back, that idea of retrospective backward glance. So noticing some differences here. And again, these are just a few examples from my life. I was going to do them about Sophie, but I didn't have time to check all the details with her. And anyway, you can see there, for example, that timeline for the first sentence, the second with the continuous of that action of living in Scotland through to when I heard about the CELTA. And not long after that, having applied, I stopped living in Scotland and went and did my CELTA in England. And there began that particular journey. Previously, I'd been teaching children, and my God, I needed a change. That's pretty hard work. Note the arrow there looking back. You could make that arrow longer. I wasn't able to without cluttering up the screen here with too many huge arrows. But the arrow looking back from that point where I needed a change, I'd had enough for that moment teaching children. And looking back from one past time to an earlier past time. But notice also the effect of the first one on the second. I think this is really important to reinforce with the perfects. There's an effect, almost like a cause effect. Yes, teaching children led to me needing a change. The next one, when I did eventually become an English language teacher, when I started teaching English, as you can see there, the fact that I'd already taught another language did help in some way. I did have some teaching skills, even though I pretty soon realised it was a very different ballgame teaching adults and teaching them my first language. But if this is any reassurance to you, at the beginning of a career, for those who are early career teachers here in the webinar, or even later ones where you're learning all the time, looking back from now, this is going to be ongoing. So those squiggly lines definitely continuing past now. But the effect looking back, connecting all of that time up to now, the fact that, yes, I do have some knowledge, I can do some things, but I am still learning. So another example of a timeline from that set, going into that a little bit more deeply, thinking about the questions you might ask based on your analysis. One part of the meaning there, that this is something that started in the past but is still true now. And the fact that we're using this retrospective angle, connecting that fact of being a trainer over that time and still now, what I know, what I can do, the experience I've got, the memories I've got. And so therefore adding a little bit of supporting detail perhaps to your timeline, or definitely adding that information you can see there on the right underneath the timeline, definitely adding that to your questions. So focusing on what's the result now. Do I know? Can I? So do I know a lot about teaching? Can I teach a range of students? Have I got a lot of experience? That kind of thing. And you can then connected up with students when they're going for a job. In the interview, people likely to ask, have you got experience? Have you worked in a restaurant before? Etc., etc. So they can see that reason for connecting now back to then, or then up to now. So another example, a bit more complex, but you'll see the similarities with the perfects, with that one about teaching children and how the timeline reinforces that remoteness, because there's now and those squiggly lines and the X's before now. So questions there, unpacking the past. Okay, by this stage, really at this level, you don't need to say, is this about the past? You might just say, so talking about the past, or this is about the past, isn't it? You know, clearly, and move on to the meatier bits. The fact that the first action is still in progress then, at that time, and you're looking back retrospectively because of this first one of teaching children, there was that effect result later where I needed the change. So your questions there might draw their attention to the fact there are two situations, which was the first, even putting numbers, the number 1 above the first, or the squiggly one, and 2 above the second where you needed a change, focusing on the fact that first one, teaching children, was long. It was seen as important. It's not just I had taught children and needed a change. I'm deliberately saying I had been teaching children because that allows me to emphasize that how long is important, and then clarify the result and consider in the context whether or not that first action, in this case of teaching children, stopped. Sometimes it may not stop in the context. You may not have a choice. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of examples about the future. Same form, different meaning. And so here, Sophie's PA, of course, Sophie has a PA. Let's call him Brandon. Today, we're a little bit behind time because of the hitches with the recording and the connections, but comparing it to sometime before the next one, someone on AusELT perhaps commenting. So here, that squiggly line going through now versus the other sometime in the future, and helping therefore reinforce the meaning, which you can base your questions on, so they're quite answerable. Okay, a couple of different future forms here to go into them a little bit more deeply, thinking about the meaning. Just ignore that squiggly X underneath, you'll see why in a second. Here, that one that Sophie's recording the next webinar, so you can relax. She had the idea before, it was arranged in her diary, she sent out the invitations, etc., but she's definitely planned, arranged with herself to record it in the future. Versus Brandon saying, it's okay, Sophie, it's fine, I'll record it for you. I had to draw that X, by the way, on my Surface Pro. That's why it was a weird squiggly X, because I wanted to put it over the time bar to emphasize the fact that here, when Brandon is saying, it's fine, I'll record it, he's deciding now on the spur of the moment, spontaneous decision there to support Sophie. Versus another example, Sophie saying this. And here you can see, particularly comparing the first timeline and the third one there, the difference between where something's been arranged, we know where and when and how, versus that general intention or plan expressed in the third one. And perhaps Sophie's colleagues here talking there. So the timelines there should reflect the meaning, and that should help you to be able to pick out the points that you want to make for your questions. We'll have a look at one in a little bit more detail so we can see those questions again as you build up the timeline, starting with that basic idea of this being in the future, and then questions that you would ask, and as you get the answers from the students, you add more to the timeline. Emphasizing here the importance of the fact that there was an arrangement made, In other words, she knew where and when and how, etc. Okay, I'm going to look at one more specific example, that one with Brandon offering to record it for her. So building that up slowly from that first timeline, then the next question, adding when he had the idea to reinforce this idea of offering spontaneously now, and reinforcing the function. Perhaps they may know the word for offer or not, but you can give them some hints if you think they may know it, or in fact just tell them whatever is the most appropriate way. You'll know your students, you can play around with these as need be. So the summary there, as I said, importance of concepts in context, building on their existing knowledge, being very focused with your questions particularly, and the tasks, a level of simplicity, that they're doable. There's a bit of variety versus a more systematic approach with some variety for the structural questions and timelines, sequence and sufficiency. Again, reinforcing that difference with the questions about vocab. You can include the vocab item in the checking question, whereas in a structural one, no. So in that example there, has he finished? They haven't heard, or they have heard a negative in this case. They can hazard a guess, yes, but it's not really helping in any way. You might want to also consider using handouts for students. Often we do these great things on the board or screen or verbally, and then it evaporates. Students might want to take it away with them. So here, giving them the questions and they can write the answers. And the timeline, I wouldn't ever really expect the students to draw the timeline themselves, but if you provide the timeline and get them to just fill in what happened at where those X's are, that would be sufficient. Here's the full example, the timelines on the handout down below with the earlier prompts they needed related to this person who was talking about going to fly to Paris, and then some on the other side, they were doing some work on pronunciation and form. So thinking about how we use our course books just as a springboard, we can play around with them, dropping things, adding things, creating things, adding more practice, giving exposure via lots of texts. You've got the readings and listenings. The audio scripts are another great source to exploit, but of course authentic materials, real life examples, yours and theirs. So they can then build on their understanding, learning by doing. So it takes some experience and awareness, but this is a great place to start, for example, with the audio scripts to see what's other interesting language in there that you can exploit with the students. Okay, so just as we've finished, just thinking about ways you can record all of this. When I originally started teaching, I had library index cards, believe it or not, but these days you might want to use a learning journal, a diary, a blog of some kind, Google Docs, something that you can share with people. There's lots of PD opportunities you can see there. Meet ELT. Bookery has just recently started doing some in Sydney. It's really very useful. And of course, reading, listening, asking questions, using your fabulous colleagues is a great resource. Ideas shared on Facebook. A couple of people that you might want to follow, their blogs. I've put the links in at the end. But hey, make and share your own materials. Write that ideal textbook because we haven't found it yet. And just noticing how you can really eventually develop the confidence to just work with whatever's coming up from the students more confidently. What follows later, you'll see there are some thoughts, some examples from Hugh Della there, for example, about exploiting the course book. I'm just going to go through this a little bit faster. So you'll see those and some other thoughts from Thornbury about his decision-making machine, for example. I've put in some other examples of timelines for different sentences so you can adapt those yourself. But yeah, it does seem to get a bit messy. Hang in there. Keep looking at language in context, thinking about aspects of time, aspects and modality. A really important issue that's come up recently is this idea of distance. Yulianto Lukito and Yanina Cascado did a very interesting workshop last year on that temporal, social, hypothetical, psychological distance. So, for example, temporal distance in time, past, present, etc. Social, you can understand when you say, for example, would you like a cup of tea compared to do you want a cup of tea, choosing the would, emphasizing that social distance. The hypothetical distance in, if I won the lottery, if I was Prime Minister. Psychological distance, where you're thinking whether something is real or not real. So, for example, you might be talking about somebody as though they're present, but they're actually no longer present. You can see that sometimes in narratives. I think when you're telling stories, telling a joke, you try to make it sound more immediate by using a present tense, so a man walks into the bar, etc. A couple of links there for you to exploit. And one suggestion of a book that I found useful, the one at the bottom, Teaching Tenses. Everyone has their favourites. It's not necessarily mine, but I did have some revelations from looking at that. So as we just go through quickly to flick through the slides so you can see what else is coming, some example timelines. If you've got questions, Sophie, are you able to see the questions or comments that people have? And people are typing in perhaps. Okay, so scrolling down, thank you for rejoining. Yes, had a really hard time teaching subject-object questions. Used all the resources in my course book, analysed the form, made a grass skirt, wasn't enough, had to revise it. I think that's not an unusual thing though, is it? People are in the process of learning, of picking it up. One idea is showing them some more visuals and some examples where they're seeing the difference when you highlight the subject or the object and then switch it around. Say if it's a subject question, turn it into an object question, but doing that visually with, say, circling the subject and putting a box around the object to differentiate those. There's a couple other questions. I know that's only a brief answer. How can you download the entire content? That's going to be made available with the slides being made available, and the link will be emailed to you. There are also some other things that I might throw into the mix, but say on the screen there you can see there's a sample of the breakdown of the timelines. I think that might be all that people have managed to type in. Is that correct? Yeah, so far. If anyone else has any questions or comments, please use the chat box. As I said, I'm unable to hear questions. And so, yeah, I think we may be almost done. Hopefully in the future, people will continue this conversation, as I said, with colleagues and elsewhere. Okay, another question's come in. Early career teachers that I work with have difficulty identifying essential elements of meaning of target language, definitely. Yeah, those go-to resources to help find the meaning. I think that Teaching Tenses Rosemary Aitken book is good to help them design their analysis and their questions. Idioms, oh, a whole other ball game there. We don't really have time for that one, but good question. Okay. So Malika, can I park that one about idioms? I think visuals there, but context and paraphrasing are the things that occur most of all, but also selecting what the relevant ones are. Okay, anything else we can see there in the questions? No. Okay, interesting. Thanks. Good to see your names here. Oh, ALB type questions, another one. Yes, students often answer yes, no to ALB type questions. Do I? Yeah, I do use it because I don't want to keep using yes, no questions. I find if I do, students eventually start answering very mechanically, yes, yes, yes. Oh, no, I mean no. They're not really thinking. So if I'm asking an A or B question, I often use a gesture to indicate one choice, or with the voice and then another handout for the B question. So I do think variety is important, but it's a precise choice. It's not just because of variety. It's going to be the most effective way to get to the point in a simple way. Any other questions? Might be it. This has been really interesting, and I just wanted to thank everybody and Sophie, and I'm looking forward to this conversation going on later and maybe exploring some of the questions we weren't able to deal with in a lot of detail here for the idioms, for example, and the subject-object questions in particular. Anyway.
Great. This is Sophie again. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming and also persisting through our tech hitch in the middle and for logging back in again. Thanks for that. And also just thank you, Claire, very much for coming in and sharing all of that expertise with us. There's a treasure trove of examples there for us to go through on the slides afterwards as well. It was a really great overview of the effective use of CCQs and concept checking tasks. And I also love the simplified timelines, proving that more is less. I think my timelines when I was teaching were way too detailed. So I've learned something here today as well. So thank you very much, Claire. And thank you everyone for coming. Claire just has one last thing to say.
Yeah, that just reminded me of the different timelines that you do see in different books where they've got two timelines for two particular things, but the next time they use a timeline, it's actually not consistent. I think this particular design, which has been researched over 20-odd years, is consistent. But again, just want to say thanks, good luck to everyone, and thanks to Sophie again.